Frank Herbert wrote Dune, one of the most popular and influential books ever, and Frank lived an extraordinary life. He grew up enjoying the outdoors, fishing and farming in Washington state. He worked as a journalist, and he worked for Republican politicians. Frank was an environmental activist, part of the 60s counterculture. He studied psychology and Zen Buddhism, dabbled in psychedelic drugs and the paranormal. Frank had a beautiful romance with his second wife, Bev, but as a father, he was harsh and distant. Frank had years of poverty, and he had fame and success in Hollywood and the White House. Frank wrote over 20 novels, including the famous Dune series. Frank was passionate, iconoclastic, eccentric. Frank warned against the dangers of charismatic leaders, but ironically, he became an intellectual hero to many fans. Frank's son, Brian Herbert, wrote a biography of Frank. There are also books about Frank by Tim O'Reilly, and interviews and essays by Frank himself. Together, they reveal Frank's complex personality, his adventures, his dreams, his flaws, and the inspirations behind Dune. This is the story of Frank Herbert. Childhood. In 1905, Frank's grandparents joined a socialist commune in Washington state. The group believed in equality and the greater good, though the commune soon collapsed. Some of Frank's novels are about utopias and dystopias. The Herbert family stayed in the area, and in 1920, Frank Herbert was born. Frank was close with his grandma Mary. Mary was super smart. Brian says she was an illiterate Kentucky hill woman who did incredible mathematical calculations and spoke in an Old English dialect. She taught Frank to love maths and languages, and Mary inspired the Mentats, the human computers in Dune. Frank's aunts were Irish Catholics. They tried to convert Frank to their religion, but Frank rebelled against their indoctrination. These women inspired the Bene Gesserit in Dune, the wise witches who Paul rebels against. Frank also had a great-uncle who was a locally famous circus performer called Professor Herbert. Frank's father, Frank Sr., was a policeman and an alcoholic. During the Prohibition, when alcohol was illegal, Frank Sr. raided speakeasies to confiscate their booze. But Frank Sr. secretly kept the illegal alcohol because he sold illegal alcohol in his own secret speakeasy. The speakeasy was a dance hall called the Spanish Castle, which later became a famous music venue. Jimi Hendrix played there, and he wrote a song about it called Spanish Castle Magic. And the castle all began when a young Frank Herbert ceremonially began its construction. When Frank was 2 years old, he was attacked by a Malamute dog. In the fourth Dune book, characters are attacked by terrifying grey wolves. Brian says that Frank's parents were often drunk, so young Frank had to look after himself. He explored the forests and coasts of Puget Sound, fishing and hunting. He made friends with a man called Indian Henry, who was Native American from the Hoh tribe. Henry became like a father to Frank. He taught Frank hunting and foraging techniques, and Frank admired Henry's connection to nature. Frank went on long trips in a rowboat. Brian says that when Frank was just 9 years old, he made a 200-mile journey on his own by attaching his boat to larger ships that were passing by, bit like riding sandworms in Dune. Frank said that these waters were his home and a source of renewal. A character in Dune calls herself Sea Child, drawing strength and identity from the sea. In Dune, Paul's homeworld is a place of water and greenery. But in later years, Frank's hometown was polluted by industrial waste. This might have inspired the polluted Harkonnen planet in Dune, as well as sparking Frank's interest in environmental issues. Frank was a teenager during the Great Depression, and he said that this was one of the best times in his life. His family had no money, but they farmed for meat and fruit. They hunted deer, caught salmon, dug for oysters, and Frank loved living off the land, doing practical, hands-on work. He learned to fix machines. He says that he grew up with a screwdriver in one hand and pliers in the other. He liked tools that you could understand and control yourself. But Frank was suspicious of advanced, automated technology that can make you dependent and unthinking. In the Dune universe, computers and AI are banned. When Frank signed his books, he would cross out his printed name before signing by hand. Frank preferred the human touch. From a young age, Frank loved books. He grew up reading H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Shakespeare, Ezra Pound, Proust. On his 8th birthday, Frank declared that he was going to be an author. Frank often told stories to entertain his Boy Scouts friends. He loved the spoken word, the sounds of language. So even in his writing, Frank thought about the rhythm and the music in his words. Frank wrote poetry and infused it into his prose. At school, Frank joined the debate team and the school newspaper. After school, Frank got a job at a newspaper by lying about his age, and he worked as a reporter, editor, and photographer for most of the next 30 years. Frank said he was very influenced by the journalistic attitude. He said that when you want to learn something, you ask people, you knock on doors. Frank never hesitated to ask questions. He was endlessly curious about everything, and he followed his goals with boundless energy and determination. Wives. When Frank was 21, he met a teenager named Flora, and they impulsively got married at a courthouse. Frank and Flora had a baby named Penelope, after Odysseus's wife in Greek mythology. Then Frank joined the Navy in 1942, as America entered World War II. In the Navy, Frank mostly did paperwork and played poker. But while Frank was away, his wife Flora left him and took the baby. Their relationship only lasted about a year. Frank got a head injury and was discharged from the Navy. Frank went to college in Seattle and studied psychology, maths, and English. In a creative writing class, he fell in love with a raven-haired Scottish girl named Beverly. They bonded over their loves of reading and writing. Frank dropped out of college and married Bev. Frank and Bev honeymooned in a firewatch station in the Cascade Mountains. They had no electricity or plumbing, but they had a record player that they hauled in on a donkey. They invented their own card game, a special version of Hearts that only they knew. Frank and Bev had 2 sons, Brian and Bruce. Frank's ex-wife Flora wanted child support for Penelope, and Frank didn't pay child support on time, so Flora sued him. Over the years, Frank moved house 23 times, partly to avoid Flora and her lawyers. Frank worked for newspapers all over the West Coast. He learned how to research and how to write news stories fast, but he wanted to write fiction. His first stories were adventure tales published in pulp magazines, but soon Frank was mostly writing science fiction. 'Cause sci-fi let him create any setting without limits. He used imaginary worlds to question our assumptions about reality. Frank's writing is dense with philosophical ideas, challenging his readers to think differently. Some years, Frank focused on writing, and his wife Bev worked to support the family. Bev wanted to be a writer herself, but she sacrificed her own hopes of a writing career to support Frank's writing. Frank and Bev had a deep, symbiotic bond. She didn't like to drive, so he drove her everywhere. She helped him write, giving him feedback and ideas. Bev was his guardian angel and his best friend. Frank said that Bev was the best thing that ever happened to him. Some years, Frank's family could barely afford food, so Frank had crazy ways to save money. Like, Frank signed up to lots of junk mailing lists so that he could burn the junk mail for heating. They struggled, but Bev believed that Frank would make it as an author. Influences. In 1949, Frank moved near San Francisco. He made friends with local artists and intellectuals, including a couple of psychologists, Irene and Ralph Slattery. Irene had worked with the famous Carl Jung in Zurich, and she taught Frank about Jung's theories. Jung believed in a collective unconscious, myths and archetypes shared by all humans. This inspired the genetic memory ideas in Dune. Frank based his characters on Jungian personality theories. He said that Jung was a huge influence on him. Irene also told Frank about Berlin in the 30s, where she saw Hitler giving speeches to adoring crowds. This influenced Frank's views on the danger of charismatic political leaders. Frank and the Slatterys also studied Freud, Piaget, Adler, Jaspers, Heidegger, psychologists and philosophers who Frank often referenced in his writing. Frank made friends with Alan Watts, who wrote popular books about Zen Buddhism. Frank particularly liked Alan's argument that uncertainty and danger is a path to wisdom. Zen Buddhism influenced the Zen Sunni Fremen in Dune, and the philosophy of the Bene Gesserit. Frank loved Japanese culture. He wrote haiku and painted kanji on rice paper. He learned judo. He gave Bev a kimono. Frank was a bit of a weeaboo. Frank studied the general semantics of Alfred Korzybski. He argued that language changes how we think, that words can carry false assumptions. Frank studied world religions, myth, the hero's journey. He read a book about sex and war that informed the jihads and genetics in Dune. And Frank was interested in the paranormal. In the 30s, there were experiments with extrasensory perception, or ESP. Researchers claimed that people could identify symbols on cards without seeing them, by using psychic powers, and Frank said that he experienced ESP. Frank claimed that he correctly guessed every card in a pack of cards twice. Frank's wife Bev was deeply interested in the paranormal. Frank said that Bev was a witch with special intuitive powers. Bev used astrology and palm reading and the I Ching to predict the future, and Frank used Bev's predictions to decide when he'd fly aeroplanes. These supernatural interests influenced Paul's visions of the future in Dune. So Frank had many different intellectual interests, a heady blend of philosophy and psychology, science and pseudoscience that would all influence Dune. Politics. In the 50s, Frank worked as a speechwriter for Republican Senator Guy Cordon. Frank went to Washington, D.C., and did research in the Library of Congress, the biggest library in the world. This inspired Frank to write a sci-fi story about a galactic library. Senator Cordon did land use policy, so Frank studied agriculture, ecology, and economics. Frank and Cordon both believed in limiting the power of federal government. They wanted to cut spending and cut bureaucracy. Frank believed in individual freedom and constitutional rights. Frank was a gun enthusiast and a member of the NRA. He hated the IRS tax agency, and he was very critical of welfare and social security. Frank met Joseph McCarthy and attended some Army McCarthy hearings. Frank felt that McCarthy's anti-communist fanaticism went too far. Frank worked on Cordon's re-election campaign, but Cordon lost. Then Frank worked for 3 other Republican politicians, but they also all lost their elections. Frank's experience made him cynical about politics. He said he had a crude awakening, that the government doesn't work how it's supposed to. Frank said that Washington, D.C. is a cesspool. He said the government is dominated by unelected bureaucrats and corrupt civil servants. And Frank also criticized charismatic leaders. Frank said that President John F. Kennedy was dangerous because people followed him blindly, that JFK built a larger-than-life mythology around himself, leading the US into the Vietnam War. One of the key messages in Dune is that we should not blindly follow our leaders. Frank said President Nixon made some good decisions, but he also said Nixon was a liar who taught us to never trust government. Frank said positive and negative things about President Reagan. Frank said he preferred capitalism to communism, but he criticized big corporations and said that any centralized power leads to bureaucracy and stagnation. Frank said all governments lie. He said don't trust any authority. Instead, Frank suggested a direct democracy system, where power is given to randomly chosen voters. Because Frank didn't believe in government, but he did believe in people. He said if you give people responsibility and opportunity, they rise to the occasion. Trips. Frank hung out with some famous sci-fi authors, including Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, and he knew a young George R.R. Martin. Frank was especially close with writer Jack Vance. In 1953, Frank and Jack drove to Mexico together with their families. In Mexico, Frank met a retired army general who gave Frank some special cookies. Frank ate 2 cookies and then found out that the cookies contained, quote, the most expensive North African hashish in the world, flown in by the Mexican Air Force for the general. So Frank got super high and hallucinated. At other times, Frank drank a psychedelic morning glory tea and tried peyote. Mushroom expert Paul Stamets claims that Frank also used psilocybin magic mushrooms, like a lot. Though Brian Herbert claims that Frank only used drugs 3 times. Either way, Frank's drug experiences clearly influenced the drugs and expanded consciousness in Dune. In interviews, Frank criticized the criminalization of drugs, though he also warned that drugs can cause harm and dependence. When Frank was 35, he published his first novel. It was called The Dragon in the Sea, or Under Pressure, set on a submarine, exploring psychology, leadership, and power. Frank was paid $6,000 for the novel, so Frank bought a new car. He bought a second-hand hearse. You know, a car for dead people. When Frank parked his hearse at restaurants, they always served his food quicker to make him leave, which Frank thought was great. Frank was being chased by debt collectors and his ex-wife's lawyers, so Frank and his family went back to Mexico. They drove 3,000 miles in the second-hand hearse. Frank kept a gun hidden in the door of the hearse. His son Brian brought his beloved dog Dusty, but Dusty peed in the car, so Frank left Dusty behind, and Brian lost his best buddy. When Mexican villagers saw the Herbert hearse coming, many stopped to pray, which Frank and Bev found hilarious. And for a few months, Frank's family lived in a Mexican village. At first, the locals didn't like Frank. Someone stole the mirrors off his hearse. But then Frank treated an infection in the local priest's hand, and Frank became popular. Having studied agriculture, Frank taught local farmers advanced farming methods, like in Dune, when Kynes teaches ecology to the Fremen. One time in Mexico, Frank was walking on sand when he heard a weird echoing sound, and this inspired the drum sand in Dune. Frank finished a second novel in Mexico, but publishers rejected it. Frank ran out of money and had to borrow from relatives to get back home. Frank had taught English to a Mexican woodworker named Pepe, and Frank brought Pepe back to America, hoping to help him get citizenship. Brian says that Frank was very generous and kind to friends and strangers, but that Frank was unkind to his children. Fatherhood. Frank had 3 kids. With his first wife, Flora, he had his daughter Penelope, or Penny, who mostly grew up with Flora, and with his second wife, Bev, Frank had his sons, Brian and Bruce. Brian says that Frank was a harsh, angry father. Frank would get enraged over nothing. He constantly yelled at his sons and hit them as punishment. Frank used a lie detector machine to terrify Brian, which Brian compares to the pain box in Dune. Frank didn't tolerate any noise. His kids had to tiptoe in their home, and they couldn't have friends over, so that they wouldn't disturb Frank's writing. Brian suggests that Frank didn't understand children, because Frank had never really been a child himself. Frank was independent from a young age, and he expected his own kids to be the same. Brian says that Frank didn't bond with his children, that he tried to crush their will and their spirit. Brian felt that Frank loved his stories more than he loved his children. As a teenager, Brian started binge drinking, and almost died drink driving. Frank and Bev had to bail Brian out of jail several times. Frank's younger son, Bruce, was gay, and Frank disapproved of his sexuality. There are rants about homosexuality in the Dune books, associating gay people with sadomasochism and immaturity. While Frank was working on Dune, Bruce says that Frank kicked him out of home. For a while, Bruce lived in a drug house and abused amphetamines. Later, Bruce worked in electronics and became a gay activist in San Francisco. When Bruce came out to his parents, Frank and Bev were not pleased. Bruce felt deeply wounded by his father's rejection. Bruce said Frank wasn't there for him. In the 90s, Bruce died of AIDS. Brian only became close with Frank later in life. Brian spent years trying to understand his father. Brian obsessively documented Frank's life, and Brian became a writer himself. Brian co-wrote some 17 prequels and sequels to Frank's Dune books. Brian says that writing brought him closer to his father, allowed him to forgive Frank. So, Frank failed to build good relationships with his young sons, and even this is reflected in Dune. Paul has 2 adoptive sons in the book, who appear briefly but aren't mentioned again, as though they're not important. Brian wrote that Frank knew so well how to work, but knew only intermittently how to love. Dune. Frank was interested in ecology, the study of ecosystems and environments, and in the 50s Frank learned about sand dunes in Oregon. The government was planting grasses to stop sand dunes from moving and covering roads, so Frank flew a light plane to see the dunes from above, like Paul's flight in Dune. And Frank started to imagine a desert world. One of Frank's best friends was Howard Hansen, a writer and Quileute Native American man. Frank and Howard often spoke about the environment. Howard was angry about logging. He said, "They're gonna turn this whole planet into a wasteland." And Frank replied, "Like a big dune." Frank wanted to write a story that combined desert ecology with his ideas on political and religious leaders. So for 6 years, Frank researched desert cultures, history, languages. He read about Islam and the Arabic world. He used heaps of Arabic words for the Fremen in Dune. Frank read about Lawrence of Arabia, who joined Bedouin desert people to fight the Ottoman Empire. He read about Muslims in the Caucasus who resisted the Russian Empire. He copied entire phrases from a particular book called Sabres of Paradise. Frank referenced the ecology of Rachel Carson and Paul B. Sears. He read an essay by Samuel Butler about technology and named the Butlerian Jihad after him. Frank said that he read 200 books in his research for Dune. He mostly read non-fiction, but he also read sci-fi. Dune is partly a response to Foundation by Isaac Asimov, because Foundation is about science and rationality defeating chaos, but Dune is about the importance of unpredictability and the unconscious. The main themes of Dune are the danger of political leaders, the importance of environments, and the power of the mind. And each of these themes grew from Frank's experiences, in politics, in the outdoors, and in philosophy. Everything he'd learned went into Dune. Frank said to put everything into your writing, never hold anything back. And as always, Frank's wife Bev helped him write, with feedback and ideas. Brian says that Frank and Bev were a writing team. Howard says that Frank wouldn't exist as an author if it wasn't for Bev. From 1963, Dune was published as a monthly serial in Analog magazine, but Frank struggled to publish Dune as a book. It was rejected by 23 publishers, until it was finally published as a book in 1965 by a publisher that was best known for car repair manuals. They paid $7,500 for what would become one of the best-selling novels of all time. Dune won some awards, but early reviews were negative, and sales were slow. Frank had Dune sequels planned, but for now he felt drained, so for a while he pursued other projects. Frank went to Vietnam as a war correspondent and criticized US involvement. He became a wine reviewer and made his own wine. He bought a boat and named it Arrakis. He built a houseboat with Jack Vance, but it sank. He invented a gun that shot spice into meat. He tried to move to Samoa. Frank was always full of wild ideas and dreams, many of which were never fulfilled. But Frank kept dreaming and kept writing. He wrote more sci-fi novels about consciousness, ecology, dystopia, and religion, going deeper into themes that he'd touched on in Dune. And in 1968, Frank wrote the second Dune book, Dune Messiah. Messiah is a dark, strange book that deconstructs the hero Paul Atreides. Analog magazine refused to publish Messiah because it was too depressing. While Frank was writing Messiah, Frank's father died. Frank hurt his back, Bev broke her ankle, MLK and RFK were killed. So it was a dark, painful year when Frank wrote his dark, painful Dune book. Environmentalism. In the 70s, Dune became popular among college students. Frank spoke at colleges across America. He criticized government and the Vietnam War, and he spoke passionately on the environment. Frank argued for renewable energy, reducing pollution, and preserving the planet for future generations. At the first Earth Day, Frank told the crowds to love planet Earth. Frank also criticized ideologues who oversimplify environmental issues. Frank didn't believe that we should leave nature totally untouched or anything, but he wanted us to think about the consequences of our choices. Frank was interviewed in popular media. Dune sales increased. Frank was becoming a famous author. He bought a house in Washington state, and he called it Xanadu for a poem that Bev liked. At Xanadu, Frank and Bev loved to garden and farm, to cook, drink wine, host dinner parties with great conversation. And Frank explored his environmental interests. Frank built an ecological demonstration project to experiment with renewable energy. He helped invent a new kind of wind turbine, and he harnessed methane from chicken manure. Frank built a solar heating system using recycled beer cans. He wanted to prove that you could live comfortably using renewable energy in harmony with nature. Fans wanted more Dune books, but Frank explored other projects. He spent time with Northwest Native American groups, recording legends and songs, and he wrote a novel about Native Americans called Soulcatcher. Frank traveled across South Asia and made a documentary about land reform. He wrote a book about fighter pilots. Then, in 1976, Frank published the third Dune book, Children of Dune. Children brings together Frank's political and ecological themes, ending with a subversive twist. This was the end of the original Dune trilogy that Frank had planned, so he said that Children was the last Dune book. Hollywood. There were many attempts to make Dune into a movie. Alejandro Jodorowsky spent millions developing his film. The cast was going to include Mick Jagger, Orson Welles, and Salvador Dali, as well as Jodorowsky's own 12-year-old son Brontes playing the lead role of Paul. H.R. Giger did concept art and built Harkonnen furniture which was supposedly made of actual skeletons. Giger's aesthetic was later used for the movie Alien. Jodorowsky's Dune got way too expensive. Jodorowsky wanted his movie to be 10 or 20 hours long, so it was never filmed. Then, in 1977, the first Star Wars movie came out, and Frank was angry that Star Wars was so similar to Dune. Like Dune, Star Wars has a desert planet, an ambush by hooded desert people, big machines called sandcrawlers, and moisture farming. There's a young mystic hero rebelling against a space empire, an old mentor from an ancient order uses voice to control people, Luke's sister Leia is similar to Paul's sister Aaliyah, Star Wars mentions spice mines and a Dune Sea, it has melee combat and low-tech societies in a space-age galaxy, the sequel has a giant worm and reveals that the hero is related to the villain. Star Wars is so similar to Dune that Frank talked about suing George Lucas. In a Dune book, Frank subtly referenced Star Wars and implied that it's a cheap copy. And they kept trying to make a Dune movie. There were some weird Dune movie scripts. Like, in one, Jessica levitates and Mapes has 3 breasts. At one point, Ridley Scott was involved. His version added an incestuous relationship between Paul and his mother Jessica, which outraged Frank. Scott left and made Blade Runner instead. Then, in the 80s, David Lynch began his Dune movie. Frank liked Lynch. They played volleyball together in Brian's backyard. Frank helped write the movie's script, and he visited the film shoot in Mexico. Frank was optimistic that Lynch's Dune movie would be a great adaptation of his books. And Frank had more side projects. He helped with the script for the Flash Gordon movie. He wrote a book about a plague and found that it was worryingly easy to buy dangerous biochemicals. Frank co-wrote a book about computers, and he ordered a custom state-of-the-art writing computer with an enormous 10-megabyte capacity. Frank's fame continued to rise. He went on huge book tours and interviews. Studios wanted movies of more of his books. He appeared in a Super Bowl ad. After years of obscurity, Frank achieved massive success. But while Frank's career soared, his wife Bev got sick. Hawaii. When Bev was 47, she had lung cancer. They treated the cancer, but her heart was damaged, and over the next 10 years, this condition slowly killed her. Bev was everything to Frank. They'd been inseparable for 30 years. She was his best friend, greatest support, his writing collaborator. Bev had sacrificed her own writing career so that Frank could succeed. So when Bev got sick, Frank did everything he could for her. Bev struggled in cold weather, so Frank built a house for her in Hawaii. It was an elaborate home in remote Maui, decorated in Japanese and nautical style, designed to be accessible for Bev's health condition. Frank made all the construction workers learn CPR for Bev, just in case. They called their home Kawaloa. Brian says it was a palace in paradise, built by an emperor for his empress. Kawaloa was not practical. In remote 80s Hawaii, Frank and Bev were isolated from friends and family, and it was harder for Bev to get medical care. But in these hard years, Kawaloa was a dream that kept them going. Frank wrote a 4th Dune book, God Emperor of Dune. It mostly involves an old worm ranting about politics and is widely considered one of the best in the series. But the emotional heart of the book is a doomed romance between Emperor Leto and his wife Hui, reflecting the tenderness and the pain in Frank and Bev's last years. The book was successful, but Frank needed more money. The Hawaii home was expensive. Bev's healthcare was expensive. They were often flying overseas, going on book tours in chauffeured limousines. They owed money on several houses and several boats. They still owed taxes to the IRS. And Frank was terrible with money. Bev had always done their finances, so when Bev was sick, Frank couldn't cope. With costs rising, Frank quickly wrote 2 more Dune sequels. The 5th book, Heretics of Dune, came out in 1984, and Frank started the 6th book. Bev came up with the title, Chapterhouse Dune. But Bev's health got worse and worse. Bev stopped eating. Frank stopped sleeping. In her last days, Bev allowed no one but Frank to touch and to care for her. In 1984, Bev died, aged 57. They scattered her ashes at Kawaloa on a kamani tree. In a touching essay, Frank wrote that he and Bev found joy together, even in her dying moments. Final years. Frank was devastated by Bev's death. He suddenly lost weight. He impulsively shaved off his iconic beard that had made him look so wise. Brian said that Frank looked smaller, more fragile now. Bev knew that without her, Frank would be lost, so she wrote a list of things for him to do after she died. She made him promise to finish writing Chapterhouse Dune, and to write a book with their son Brian. She also wanted Frank to remarry. Frank struggled with Chapterhouse. He could barely function without Bev, let alone write, but he finished the book and dedicated it to Bev. The final chapter in Frank's Dune series is about an old couple in their garden, evoking Frank and Bev and their love. Frank co-wrote a sci-fi book with Brian, and finally tried to be closer with his son, though Frank was still distant with his other son, Bruce. Frank remarried. He married his publicist, Teresa, who was 36 years younger than Frank. Frank said that he received messages from Bev from beyond the grave, saying that she approved of this marriage. Bev had always stabilized Frank's emotions. Without her, his behavior became erratic. Frank planned to hike the Himalayas and to become the oldest man to ever climb Mount Everest. He wanted to buy a fast Porsche. He was trying to be young again. In an interview, he said that Bev's death was traumatic, but that he's alive and he's doing what he wants to do. Frank had many plans for more projects and more books, but the only ones that he finished were the 2 books he had promised to Bev. In 1984, the David Lynch Dune movie came out. It was one of the most expensive and heavily advertised movies of its time. There was a screening, then a dinner at the White House, where President Reagan told Frank that he liked the movie. Frank held charity screenings and donated the money to a hospital that treated Bev. In a speech at a premiere, Frank wept as he said, "This is for Bev." Frank's fame peaked in the same year that he was broken by Bev's death. The Dune movie was not as successful as Frank hoped. Frank said that he liked the film, but he increasingly complained that it made changes and cuts from his book. David Lynch disowned the film. Frank started working on a 7th Dune book, but in 1985, Frank was diagnosed with cancer. He tried to be optimistic, but a few months later, Frank died. He was aged 65. The day Frank died, he was writing a new story on a laptop in hospital. His death came 4 days after the 2nd anniversary of Bev's death. Frank Herbert was complicated. He was a farm boy who loved a simple life in nature, and he imagined wild sci-fi universes. Frank was an environmental anti-war activist in the psychedelic 60s counterculture, and he worked for Republican politicians. He liked guns, and he liked Zen. He was skeptical, and he believed in the paranormal. Frank was intensely critical of welfare and taxes. He spoke of independence and self-reliance, but at times he relied on charity and loans that he sometimes failed to repay. Frank had deep, loving relationships with Bev and with friends, but in some ways he failed to love his own children. Frank warned against charismatic leaders, but he became an intellectual guru to millions of fans. A key message in Frank's work is that there are no absolutes. There is no one answer. There's no one perspective that can explain our complex universe. We must always stay open to new ideas. We must always adapt to change. And that wide-open perspective is part of why Dune is still relevant 60 years later. The one thing that Frank truly unshakably believed in was the human spirit. Amidst all his abstract philosophies and imaginary futures, he said that what's most important is to live life wholeheartedly in the present. Frank was described as the most alive man I've ever met. Frank was in love with the world, was interested in everything and everybody. He laughed as easily as he breathed. Frank wrote, "The mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience." In the final Dune book, Frank wrote, "It's good to be alive. Remember that." We're making more videos about Dune, so like and subscribe. References and sources for this video are listed below. If you appreciate the work behind these videos, you can support AltShiftX on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and thanks to the patrons, including Wayne Hamilton, Daniel Marino, Jack Feeney, Kit Sims, and Rasmus. Cheers.